touch him. People think he ran 20 times, but he only touched the ball 3 times and scored 2 touchdowns. He was probably one of 2 black people in the entire Hemingway Stadium. The next year, Ole Miss signed their first 2 black players, Ben Williams and James Reed, and that changed history for Ole Miss and integration. So those are the kind of stories that are in this book.
Let me tell one more about Wee Willie. A really good friend of the offensive line coach at Southern at the time was Hamp Cook. He later became a scout for the New Orleans Saints, and he was a little All-American at Southern back when they were playing small college football. And he told me this years after the fact, and I was working on a story on the 25th anniversary of that game, and I called Hamp to jog my memory and all that, and I talked to him about those 2 touchdowns that Willie scored, and he said, yeah, I could not wait to get back to my office and watch the film and see how well my lineman had blocked Ole Miss on those 2 plays. And he said, he called me Ricky, he said, Ricky, we didn't block anybody. He said, Willie just dodged them all. He was 5'4" and weighed 143 pounds. Yeah. And so it took a lot of courage just physically to be out there. But it took a whole lot more courage from the standpoint of being the first one. And he was the first African American who made a difference for any of the 3 major programs in Mississippi. And golly, 50 years later, I did the eulogy at Willie's funeral.
Wow.
He was a nice man. He became a public school teacher in Jackson at Monroe High School. Yeah, okay. Where my daughter graduated. Yeah.
So this book also has tons of statistics, and if you look through it, when you flip through it, you'll see that Mississippi, from high school through college and junior college, has laid claim to 33 national championships. No other state even comes close. And in those early 60s, Ole Miss, Jackson State, and Southern all had claims to national championships within a 2 or 3 year period there. There's also a great story that, has anybody in this room ever heard of Gil Reese?
Yeah.
You have?
Yeah.
He was from Tupelo. Yeah, so, of course, Jane, you would know that. So,
probably the smartest one, too.
That's right.
Oh, thank you. 2 miracles in one.
See? Proves your point. So there's a picture of him right here. Gil Reese was called the Tupelo Flash. He was a great high school player from Tupelo. His classmate was a guy named Hook Stone. You know Hook Stone?
Yeah.
And went to play for Mississippi A&M Aggies. Gil Reese went to Vanderbilt, and he started all 4 years when he was at Vanderbilt. He ran the 100-yard dash in 10.1 seconds, which was unheard of at that point in time. He was an All-Southern Conference all 4 years, and in his senior year, he was the captain of the Vanderbilt football, baseball, and basketball teams. And if any of you are on newspapers.com, I encourage you to go back and read some of the stories from 23 to 25, the Tennessean, the national newspaper. The things they write about this kid from Tupelo, it's like he's some hero that has saved the Commodores. They talk about how gregarious he is and how nobody could catch him on the field, and he was the nicest young man and he's the perfect leader. It's just the damnedest thing you've ever seen. But Gil Reese then went on to play professional baseball and professional football, and he played in Memphis in 1927 for the first pro team there. And that team was owned by Clarence Saunders. Does anybody know who that is, that name? Who is that? Pink Palace, but he's known for Piggly Wiggly. He started the first full-service grocery store. So Clarence Saunders owned the Memphis Tigers, and Gil Reese was their star in 1927. He also coached the team. The following year, they were not a member of the NFL. They did exhibition matches, and they beat the NFL world champion Green Bay Packers, that Memphis team did. They were originally called Bryce Hurricanes, but they changed their name to the Memphis Tigers. Now here's something interesting. There were two players from Ole Miss and Gil Reese on that team, and in 1928, the National Football League extended an invitation for the Memphis Tigers to join the NFL. And those three would have been the first NFL players officially from Mississippi. But Clarence Saunders thought that the NFL was kind of a not very well organized, not worthy of joining organization. And he told them that he was going to build a 60,000 seat stadium in Memphis and play all of their games at home. So he passed on the NFL joining that league. And Gil Reese and Mr. Applewhite and a few others from Mississippi would have been NFL players then, but they weren't. So even without those guys, we still had more than anybody else when it came down to it. But Gil Reese was something else, and he's kind of forgotten in Tupelo history.
Another guy who ended up playing for the Memphis Tigers was Edwin Goat Hale. Anybody ever heard of him?
Yeah, Goat Hale.
Goat Hale. He played at Mississippi College, and he played in 2015 and 2016. He was an All-American at Mississippi College, and Mississippi College back then played at the highest level. In fact, I'll get to a story about that in a minute, but then
1916.
Yeah, 1916. Yeah. So he decided after his sophomore year, we were in World War I, and he decided he wanted to fight for his country. So we volunteered and was fighting in the army in fighting the Germans in France. And he got shot in the leg, and everybody just presumed dead because they couldn't find him. Well, it turned out they found him finally in a remote French hospital, and it was just his leg. He wasn't in any danger of dying, and of course he was discharged, came back, recovered, went back out for football at Mississippi College after the war. He said, I never was as good as I was before I got shot in my leg. But that's pretty debatable, because that next year, the first year that he played after the war, he led the nation in scoring with 24 touchdowns. And what's more, he kicked the extra point after all 24 touchdowns. And Edwin Goat Hale. He got his nickname because he ran. Back then, you didn't wear helmets, but he ran with his head down, and they said he butted people like a goat. Yeah. And
so in the 30s, after he would have been in his mid-30s, the way he got hooked up with the Memphis Tigers was they played exhibition games, and Clarence Saunders wanted them to generate ticket revenue, so they ran an ad. They had just beaten the Green Bay Packers and said, we'll take any challengers. And Goat Hale put together a team of Mississippi All-Stars to come and play the Memphis Tigers and beat them. And that's how he got introduced to the Memphis team. So they're great stories from way back about what happened in this state.
Here's how good Mississippi College was back then. That year he came back and played for Mississippi College, they beat Ole Miss 70-0. Mississippi College beat Ole Miss 70-0. Yeah.
Ole Miss wasn't that good until the 40s.
They weren't very good until they hired Johnny Vaughn.
Yeah.
Well, Harry Mayer
did, and he had Bruiser Kennard. Oh, speaking of that, we discovered a lot of things in researching this book. One of them, again, it's kind of a Gil Reese story, but this one is for the Coast. So everybody knows who Bruiser Kennard is, right? Y'all have heard of Bruiser Kennard. Generally considered the first All-American from Mississippi. Well, he was the first All-American who played college in Mississippi. But there was a young man from Bay St. Louis named Marchmond Schwartz. His nickname was Marchie Schwartz. And he played at St. Stanislaus and was a resident of Bay St. Louis. and he played there through 1928, and he was recruited to play for Notre Dame. So he went to Notre Dame in 1929 and 1930, played for Newt Rockne's 29 national championship team and the following coach's team in 1930. He was a consensus All-American both years from Bay St. Louis, a full 7 years before Bruiser Kennard was a consensus All-American, and everyone had forgotten about Marchie Schwartz, and there's a full page on him in this book.
Yeah. You know what, Bruiser obviously he's a member of the College Football Hall of Fame and the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He's a charter member of the College Football Hall of Fame. But I think his claim to fame was that when he was at Ole Miss, he played both ways, offense and defense. He also did the place kicking. And in one game against Union of Tennessee, Union College, what is it now?
I don't know.
I'm not sure.
Union University.
Union
Okay,
University.
It still is, okay.
Okay, so he kicks off the ball. It goes into the other end zone. Guess who recovered it in the end zone for a touchdown? Bruiser. He kicked it off and recovered it in the end zone for a touchdown. That ought to get you in the Hall of Fame.
It should. He was the biggest, fastest guy on the team, and I think I've heard you say this. Rick's guess is that this guy from Union went over to pick it up, saw Bruiser, and ran the other way.
That is my guess.
We don't know, but claim to fame.
Yeah.
So questions? Y'all have any questions about anything?
Talk about two games. One, Billy Cannon's run, beating Ole Miss 7-3 when they were ranked number 1 and number 3, and then the state win over Alabama in 1980.
Yeah, there's big spreads particularly on the state Alabama game, but I'll talk about the state Alabama game first because I just did an interview for ESPN yesterday about that game because state and Alabama next year will be the first year that state and Alabama haven't played each other in like 80 years.
Really?
Yeah, the new SEC scheduling thing. Everybody thinks that Ole Miss and State would be the two schools that are closest together. No, it's State and Alabama are the two closest schools together in the SEC. So, funny story about the State-Alabama game in 1980 was Bama was ranked number 1 and hadn't lost an SEC game in 4 years. And Mississippi State hadn't beaten them since the early 50s. I mean, it was, but it was a big national game because State had only lost once that season and Alabama was undefeated. Alabama was only a 20-point favorite. So all the national sports writers college football writers were in Jackson that day. And I was working for the Clarion Ledger, and we, of course, felt it incumbent upon us to entertain all the other visiting writers. So when all the establishments closed down in Jackson, we went out to the reservoir where there were it's a resort status. And so we continued on out there until about 4 a.m., and it was one of those early kickoff games. And I'm telling you what, the over and under on aspirin in that press box was really high. And if you bet the over, you won. But we thought, well, this is the one thing that made us feel okay about it is we knew we could do our work quickly after the game. We'd all written, Alabama beats Mississippi State a million times. It wasn't going to take long. About midway through the fourth quarter, we're looking at each other, and of course, our editor at the paper's already decided we're going to put out an 8-page special section. So we didn't walk out of the Clarion Ledger building that next morning until about 1 a.m. But it's still, you think of a 6-3 game that it would be boring, but there was absolutely nothing boring about it. It was incredible game. You talk to all those players on the state team, though, and one of the first things they'll bring up is the locker room after the game when Bear Bryant came in escorted by 2 Alabama policemen. The locker, you can imagine what celebration was going on in the locker room, and all of a sudden people kept going, look, 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 and it was Bear Bryant. And so they got a metal chair, one of those metal folding chairs, and the patrolman helped him get up on the chair to talk to the state team. And he just told him, he said, in the papers tomorrow, they're going to call this a big upset. He said, don't let anybody tell y'all that. You deserve to win. You were a better team today. You whipped our butts. And it's one of the classiest things I've ever seen. But he was a classy guy. What was the other game you asked about?
Unfortunately, the Halloween night game.
Oh!
I attended both of those games, the Ole Miss LSU game in 1959, the best college football game I've ever seen. And they probably had more pro players there on both sides.
Oh, it was unbelievable. If not for that game, that 59 Ole Miss team would probably be rated the best college football team of all time. They scored 349 points that season and gave up 21.
And they beat LSU in the Sugar Bowl.
21-0. And that's what, if you talk to any of those, everybody wants to talk about the Billy Cannon game, but you mention it to any of those players from Ole Miss, and they'll, before you can even get through with asking the question, said, talk about January 1st. Billy Cannon carried the ball, 12 times for 9 yards in that rematch. And every time he got it, Larry Grantham was hanging on him when he got the ball. It was, what was funny, Jake Gibbs, who's featured a lot in this book, but Jake said that he didn't say it, I saw it back when he was the coach at Ole Miss, baseball coach at Ole Miss, and they would play in Baton Rouge. Every time he would go out to talk to a pitcher on the mound, somebody would play the recording of the 89-yard punt return over the loudspeaker.
Yeah. What a lot of people forget about that game was when Cannon made that 89-yard punt return, you couldn't hear yourself think. They kicked off to Ole Miss, and Ole Miss took Jake Gibbs and some of those starters out, put in Doug Elmore, quarterback. I think he was the third. Yeah. He took them down to the 1 yard line. 14 seconds to go in the game, and he rolled out, and they stopped him right on the goal line. That's what the game ended.
You know who made the tackle?
Billy Cannon or Johnny Robinson won.
Billy Cannon.
Yeah.
Well, he was in on it. Billy Cannon was in on the tackle.
Robert Kyatt has a lot to say about that. He thought John Vaught was the greatest coach on earth, but when they got a first down on the 8-yard line, on the sidelines were sitting Charlie Flowers and Jake Gibbs and Waxy and all these fabulous offensive players, and it was a different era, but you call timeout, you could have put that unit back in.
And they had timeouts. The other thing that Robert still miffed about is that the whole second half, Ole Miss was punting on 2nd and 3rd down. They punted on 2nd down.
Well, the defense was so good, those 21 points. So for the year, they gave up an average of 2.1 points a game. Their defense was unbelievable, and of those 3 touchdowns, only one was a drive. One was a result of a fumble deep in their own territory, and one was from a muffed punt. So one team all year drove the ball down for a touchdown.
Yeah.
That's how good they were.
I remember talking to Charlie Flowers, and this was when Billy Brewer was still the coach at Ole Miss, so it was a good 30, 40 years after the game. And I remember I asked Flowers, well, I know you played fullback on offense. What did you play on defense? And he said, I was a linebacker. And I said, you must have made 100 tackles a game. And he said, no, I played linebacker on the end behind Larry Grantham. He said, they never got to me. Yeah.
So I have a question that I posed to this group. There's a full-page feature of Billy Cannon in the Mississippi football book. Anybody know why?
He's from Mississippi,
That's right.
Philadelphia.
Yeah,
Born in Philadelphia.
yeah, go ahead.
Archie Who beating Tennessee at the stadium there in Jackson, that was an exciting game.
38-0.
38-0 or something.
Yeah, yeah. That was when, in the Sky Riders tour before the season, when all the riders from around the South would visit each school, and we used to ride an airplane around to visit each school. And when when visited Knoxville, they interviewed Steve Kiner, who was a linebacker, and they said, what about, somebody posed the question about Archie, said, what about Archie Manning? He's quite a thoroughbred, isn't he? And Kiner said, he's just a mule. He had one of his greatest games in that game, yeah. He sure did.
Tell a story about your interview with Bear Bryant when you were 17 years old.
Oh, yeah. It's not in this book, but it's one of my favorite stories. Alabama had, the week before, Bear had unveiled, it was a big surprise. They came out in the Wishbone. They're playing it at Southern Cal in the Coliseum. And Southern Cal was ranked #1, and they were supposed to win big. They had beaten the heck out of Alabama the year before. And Alabama, to everyone's surprise, came out in the Wishbone and beat them. Well, the next week, Alabama is playing Southern Miss in Tuscaloosa, and my paper, the Hattiesburg American, wanted me to do a big piece on Bear Bryant. So they sent me over to Tuscaloosa on the following Tuesday to interview Bryant. And he had his press conference usually right before lunch. And so I had been working at the Hattiesburg American since I was 13, and I just finally had saved up enough money to buy my first car. It was a 1971 Ford Pinto. It sounded like a sewing machine and ran like one. They didn't make them for very long for good reason. But just on the other side of Meridian, I had a flat tire. And come to find out, I couldn't turn the lug. I couldn't get one of the lug nuts off. And I finally ended up like putting the thing on it and jumping on it and turned it and cracked it just a little bit. Finally, I get there and I'm 30 minutes late for the press conference, and the man that did the sports publicist for Alabama's name was Charlie Thornton. And I said, Mr. Thornton, if I don't get something from Bear Bryant, they're going to fire me back at the paper. And they wouldn't have, but it made my story better. So he says, let me see what I can do. And he walks off down the hall, comes back smiling and says, I got good news for you. The coach is in there eating his lunch, and he's got 10 minutes for you. And I walk in there, and now I'm sweated through my clothes. I got grease all over me. He's kicked back in his desk chair with his sock feet up on his desk. And his desk was about as big as an end zone. And all of you remember, at that period of time, 1971, he was deity in the Deep South. I mean, he was the closest thing to God there was. And I'm in awe of him. And so first thing he says to me, you're Ace's son, aren't you? And I said, yes, sir. And he said, is your mama as pretty as she always was? I said, yes, sir. And he shoved a box of barbecue ribs over to me. He said, here, son, have a rib. I said, Coach, I can't. Look at me. I can't eat anything right now. He said, well, what you got? Let's start the interview, basically, is what he's saying. I opened my mouth, and nothing would come out. If it was golf and it was a 2-foot putt, they would have said I choked. And I did, I choked. I just didn't. I'd been thinking about it for 2 days and then the whole ride over, and then it just, nothing would come out. And I look, and I'm staring at him and he's staring at me, and all of a sudden I see his lips kind of curling into a smile, and he said, "Oh shit, boy, what you can do better than that." And just like that, I was fine. You know, he knew just what to say. And not only did we have a great talk that was far longer than 10 minutes, when we finished, he said, "Well, I got to go to practice. You want to go out there with me?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And we go out and we get in his golf cart and he drives us up to the tower. You know, we coached from that tower. And so he starts up the tower and I'm sitting there in the golf cart because it's legendary that nobody goes on the tower with Bear Bryant. He gets about 2 steps up there and says, "Well, aren't you coming?" So I go up on the tower with him for practice, and he's telling me what they're doing and all this. And he said, finally I said, "Well, Coach, I gotta write the story. I gotta get back to Hattiesburg." He said, "Well, hand me your notebook." And I handed him my notebook. He wrote down a name and a address, and it was a tire store. And I go there. He said, "You give this to Joe, and he'll take care of you." And so I go over there. I had to have a new tire, which they told me, and I said, "Well, you know, I didn't have a credit card in 1971 at age 18 or 17. And I said, "Well, how much is this going to cost?" He said, "Bear Bryant sent you. It ain't going to cost you anything." So all these years later, people ask me who my favorite coach is. Bear Bryant. Yeah.
Great story.
Yeah, he was something.
More questions?
So this is a book with some stats in it. You got any, either tie games at the end of the game or maybe scoreless games that are in that book?
You know, I don't know about scoreless games. There are probably some tie games, but most of the statistics, some are team statistics, but most of them are individuals. And so there's some that were real surprising to me. One of them is, of all the quarterbacks that Mississippians have had in the NFL, you know, there's a passer rating. And the highest passer rating for any given season was Charlie Connerly in 1959. He had a passer rating of 135. It's higher than all 3 seasons that Brett Favre had when he was the most valuable player, higher than Elias when he won 2 Super Bowls, absolutely at the top, higher than Steve McNair, and yet he's still not in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And by the way, that year, he was 38 years old, you know, and now everybody's marveling over Drew Brees and Tom Brady, but Charlie Connerly was doing it back then. There's also, I was really...
He was left out.
What's that?
Why do you think he was
I know why he was left out, because I campaigned for him to be in. I still campaign for him to be in. But what happened, in the way the NFL does the Hall of Fame, there is a media representative from each city. And like with New York, since they have 2 teams, there are 2 media representatives. But back then, in the period 5 years after Charlie retired, the representative in the New York media that was, you know, presented their players for the Hall of Fame was Dick Young, who was a columnist for the New York Daily News, later did a lot of TV stuff. And he and Charlie hated each other. That's what happened.
It's a real shame.
And it just he fell through the cracks. There's a lot of Mississippians that aren't in the Pro Football Hall of Fame who should be.
We got a list of them. We did some editorializing. We listed, it looks like 8 people who should or will be in the Hall of Fame. Starts with Charlie Connerly. Harold Jackson, great receiver. L.C. Greenwood is the only member of the Steel Curtain Pittsburgh defensive front line who's not in the Hall of Fame, should be.
And he led them in sacks.
Led him in sacks. Jimmy Giles.
Yeah,
Jimmy Giles. Kent Hull, for sure.
yeah.
Patrick Willis, should be.
He
Eli
will
should
be.
be. Steve McNair, probably should be, but all of those are not. But I'll tell you this, Jackson State University has more Pro Football Hall of Famers than the state of New York, if that tells you anything.
Jackson State has twice as many as any other Mississippi school, and I think as many as all the other Mississippi schools combined.
Probably so.
I'll tell you how good Jackson State football was. In 1973, Walter Payton was a senior at Jackson State, and he had hired an agent from Hattiesburg where I was working, and the agent's name was Bud Holmes. I bet you know Bud Holmes. Yeah. Anyway, Bud called me one day at the paper, said, I'm going up to senior day at Jackson State today. Would you like to ride with me? And I said, sure, I'll go. Well, senior day is when all the pro scouts from all the teams come in to measure. They time them in the 40-yard dash. They see how many times they can bench press 225 pounds. They watch them get on the scale, see exactly what they weigh. They even measure the size of their hands. So Walter, we get there just in time for the 40-yard dash. And here's how good Jackson State was. They had 21 seniors that the NFL wanted to time. So 21. And I think they had 6 Jackson State players drafted, 2 of them in the first 6 picks. I mean, that's how good they were. So Walter's the first in line to do the 40-yard dash. And they made him run it 3 times, and he ran sub 4.5 40s all time. That's really fast for a guy that big. So then he goes and sits on his helmet on the sidelines and watches all the other ones, 20 more guys do the 40-yard dash. And then when everybody's through, he walks back to the starting line, and Walter, some of you may remember, he had a real high-pitched voice. It sounded like a female. And he said, hey, y'all, watch this. No, hey, y'all, time this. And he gets in a handstand, and he handstands 40 yards. He didn't have his shirt on. You should have seen it. It was unbelievable. I mean, most times when I tell that story, people say, well, what was his time? And the answer is, I don't know. But I do know it was a world record because nobody else could do it.
Rick, you got to tell them when you're talking about Walter Payton, you got to tell them about the stringer from Columbia calling in.
Oh, yeah. We had, at the Hattiesburg American, Columbia was on the very edge of our circulation. So we didn't usually cover their games, but we had a stringer over there. And it was an elderly lady named Eva B. Beats. And for some reason, she really liked me. And she would call, and she'd always ask for Ricky. And so, and she'd tell me what Walter did. Well, it came to the last game of the season. And she said, Ricky, you ain't going to believe what that Payton boy did tonight. And I said, what'd he do, Miss Beats? And she said, he scored 6 touchdowns. And I said, wow, he scored 6 touchdowns. She said, but that's not it. She said, on the last one, he turned around and ran the last 30 yards backwards.
And that's why the Mississippi white schools didn't recruit him, because they wanted somebody quiet. And Rick has the best answer for that.
Yeah, I mean, you can teach a guy to hand the ball to the referee after he scores a touchdown. You can teach him to run in frontwards. You can't teach him to score 7 touchdowns. You know. And I think that was the year, actually, Southern Miss signed Willie Heidelberg that year and passed on Walter Payton.
Unbelievable.
Now, Willie was a great player, and I loved him to death. But Walter Payton, there ain't but one Walter Payton.
Yeah.
He's still the best all-around football player I've ever seen.
Absolutely. So there are also a lot of firsts in this book. We have the first college football game. We have the first high school football game that was Yazoo City versus Winona. We have the first African American football game, which was in 1911. Jackson State played Straight University at the fairgrounds in Jackson. And it's a great story. Jackson State hired a young man from Amherst College, and his name was John Pinkett. And he was a languages teacher at Jackson College at the time, and he had been an all-New England running back for Amherst. And he put together the Jackson State team, and we found a photograph in the Amherst yearbook of him pictured with the Jackson team because they were proud of him coaching it, and he still has his Amherst A jersey on when he coached this team. But the newspaper reports talk about how well coached the team was, and he was their coach for 2 years. And so a young man from Massachusetts started what is probably the best football dynasty in Mississippi. So, lots of stories like that.
Rick,
Yeah.
you got a Leach story?
Got what?
You got a Leach story?
I didn't hear.
Leach?
Mike
Mike Leach.
You know, the most time I ever spent around Mike Leach was when he was out of coaching, before he came. It was actually between the time he was at Texas Tech and the time he went to Washington State. He wrote a book called Swing That Sword, was the name of it. And he came to Jackson and was doing a book signing at Lemuria. And I found out about it and went out there. He was going to sign stock at noon, and then he was having the book signing at 5 o'clock. So I went out there at noon to interview him and ended up sitting with him for 4 hours, just talking to him outside Lemuria before he went to do the book signing. And here's the thing, I wanted to talk to him about football, but he wanted to talk about anything but football. He was more interested in, he wanted to know about the newspaper business. That's kind of what, he was an interesting guy, and he was, he was a lawyer, you know.
Smart fellow. We had
Real
three of the
smart.
most colorful coaches for that 3-year period, when we had Lane Kiffin, and we had Deion Sanders, and we had Mike Leach. You couldn't ask for 3 coaches who were going to get more media exposure than those 3.
Yeah, it was, and I remember Will Hall was the new coach at Southern Miss. Now, he's from up in this part of the country, and Will said, "Well, I'm not going to get very much ink, am I?"
No. Other questions? I will. Any other questions? I will point out one thing. We have lots of fun things in here, like this is Ole Miss football and popular culture, and how football players from Mississippi changed culture in America, including the very first Heisman Trophy winner, who was from St. Stanislaus. Doc Blanchard, he starred in his own movie that was a huge hit called, I think, the Doc Blanchard story. Oh, Spirit of West Point. Then you've got Charlie Connerly as the first Marlboro Man, but his wife, Perry Ann, was the first female syndicated sports columnist in the country, long before the people who you might think were the fighting to get into the locker rooms. You've got Lem Barney, the great cornerback from Gulfport and punter. Do y'all know that he has a gold record? He sang backup in What's Going On.
For Marvin Gaye.
Marvin Gaye.
He became, when Lim got up there, he was a big Marvin Gaye fan, and he found out where he lived, and he actually went and knocked on the door and introduced himself, and Marvin said, you can't be playing for the Detroit Lions, you're too little. And then Marvin Gaye, who fashioned himself as an athlete, said he asked Lim if he would get him a tryout with the Lions. And he did. He got him a tryout. And I said, well, how was he? And he said, I sang better than he played football.
But there are lots of fun things like that, including Walter Payton and Joe Montana being on Saturday Night Live in the Church Lady skit. I don't know if y'all remember those, but lots of fun things in this book.
Forget Jim Weatherly.
Oh, yeah, Jim Weatherly. He's in there, of course.
Yeah.
And he's from this part of the country.
Let me- There are 3 Alcorn State football players featured in the book. Steve McNair, obviously. I'm trying to think of, Jack Spinks,
Jack
who
Spinks.
was the first African-American from Mississippi to play in the NFL. But the third one is the one that will surprise you. The captain of the 1951 Alcorn State team was Medgar Evers.
Who was a great football player.
He was a really good football player, yeah.
And do you know the story of Jim Weatherly and how he came up with the title for that song? Do y'all know that story?
Yeah.
Well, so Jimmy went out to California to be a songwriter, and he was former quarterback at Ole Miss. And he was playing flag football with Lee Majors, the $6 million man. And they loved playing flag football together. And they were on the phone one day when Farrah Fawcett said from behind him, I've got the midnight train to Houston. The midnight plane to Houston I got to catch. And so he wrote a song, Midnight Plane to Houston, that then was later changed to Midnight Train to Georgia. And that's how that happened. So flag football with the $6 million man.
Yeah.
Y'all mentioned Jake Gibbs earlier. I don't know if you noticed or not, but he is the character in all characters. And one of the sweetest men you ever want to meet in your life.
Great guy.
He's getting married.
Yep.
He's 85.
I see him in Kroger almost every day. He's there. He's shopping.
I believe that.
Rick spent a couple hours in his basement that's like a museum now. Y'all heard
If you
about
ever,
that?
if you ever get invited to his basement, don't miss it, because there are huge sports museums that don't have as much stuff as he's got in that basement of his. It's incredible, including a great big picture of him throwing a pass in that 1960 Sugar Bowl. And I've got I think there's a picture
There
in
is.
front of that picture. And I remember asking him what the play was. He caught 33 alt something. He knew the name of the play. He said, and there are 2 LSU guys look like they're about to kill him in the picture. And he said, who was the guy?
Warner Alford.
Warner Alford missed a block on.
And he's looking back at him and saying, watch out!
They called it the lookout block. Look out!
But if you go to Jake's house, be ready to stay. So he was inducted into the Ole Miss Hall of Fame 4 years ago with 5 other people, including Richard Howarth and Bishop Duncan Gray. And so there were a lot of book readers, fans, Episcopalians there, and you're supposed to speak for at the most 10 minutes. Jake got up and started telling football stories, and there were 300 people in there, and he started at 1950 in Grenada and what he listened to and what Ole Miss and State did, and he got to 52, 53. So all the women at our table, we were there for Bishop Gray, left to go to the bathroom. They just went out. And about 5 minutes later, they opened the door and they heard, and in 1955. They said, we're only at 1955? I think he took about 30 minutes, but he's a great storyteller. He is.
My daddy loved Jake Gibbs. My daddy was a Southern guy. But when I was covering Ole Miss for the Clarion Ledger, and I would be talking to my daddy on the phone, he said, when you going back to Oxford? And I'd say, oh, I got to go later today. And he said, well, be sure to look up Jake and tell him I said hi. And Jake's just that kind of
He is.
just
He's great.
good people, period. Yeah.
Anything else? I think we're about out of time. Thank y'all. Y'all have been great.
Yeah.